At exactly the moment Washington thought it still had control, everything changed. In a single speech delivered with cold precision and zero hesitation, Mark Carney did what no world leader has dared to do in decades. He put the United States on a countdown. Not a warning, not a negotiation, a deadline. 14 days. And what happened next inside the White House? Silence, confusion, panic. Because this wasn't just diplomacy anymore. This was a power shift, unfolding in real time. And for the first time, America wasn't the one setting the terms. This crisis did not explode overnight. For weeks, pressure had been building behind closed doors. The United States had been pushing hard. It used tariffs, threats, and aggressive rhetoric designed to force Canada into compliance. The assumption in Washington was simple. Canada would eventually fold. It always had before. But this time, something was different. Carney was not merely reacting. He was calculating. Every move, every delay, every response, it was all part of a master strategy that no one in Washington fully understood until it was too late. When Carney stepped into Parliament, there was no drama in his tone. There was no raised voice, no emotional appeal. That is precisely what made it more dangerous. He spoke with absolute clarity, with structure, and with total control. He laid out the situation in a way that left no room for interpretation. Canada had been patient. Canada had been measured. But now, Canada was done waiting. And then came the moment that changed everything. Carney did not ask for cooperation. He demanded action. He presented 5 specific requirements, each one designed to hit at the core of American leverage. Remove the tariffs, restore defense commitments, respect Canadian sovereignty, compensate for economic damage, acknowledge control over resources. These were not symbolic demands, they were strategic pressure points. Each one forced the United States into a position it was not prepared for. Washington was now responding instead of controlling. And then came the deadline. 14 days. Not months, not weeks of negotiation. It was just enough time to create pressure, but not enough time to escape it. Carney made it clear, if these conditions are not met, Canada will act. Not consider, not discuss, act. That single word changed how this entire crisis is being viewed behind closed doors. Inside Washington, the reaction was immediate, but not public. Officials scrambled to assess whether this was a bluff. Intelligence teams reviewed Canada's recent moves. Trade analysts looked at supply chains. Military advisors evaluated defense risks. And the conclusion that started to emerge was something no one wanted to say out loud. This might be real. Canada might actually follow through. Because here is what makes this different. Canada did not just issue an ultimatum. It had prepared for it. Over the past several weeks, quiet agreements had been forming. There were alternative trade routes, energy partnerships, and diplomatic alignments. Step by step, Canada had been reducing its dependence while increasing its leverage. And now, for the first time, it was using that leverage openly. Back in the White House, the silence was not accidental. It was strategic confusion. Respond too quickly, and it looks like weakness. Wait too long, and the pressure builds. Reject the demands, and the consequences could be immediate. Accept them, and the political cost could be devastating. This is not a simple decision. It is a trap, and Carney designed it that way. What makes this moment even more intense is how public it has become. This was not a private negotiation leaked to the press. This was delivered live in front of Parliament, broadcast across the world. Every word was meant to send a message, not just to the United States, but to allies, markets, and global powers watching closely. And they are watching, because this is no longer just about 2 countries. This is about who sets the rules moving forward. For years, the balance of power has been predictable, but now, for the first time in a long time, that balance is being challenged. It is being challenged in a way that feels controlled, calculated, and extremely difficult to counter. And the most unsettling part? This is only the beginning. What made this moment even more explosive was not just the ultimatum itself, it was what Carney revealed next. Because after laying out the 5 demands, he did not pause, he did not soften, he did not open the door for negotiation. Instead, he moved straight into consequences, clear, detailed, immediate consequences. And that is when officials in Washington realized this was not a political message. This was a fully prepared response waiting to be activated. Carney made it unmistakably clear that if the United States failed to meet the deadline, Canada would begin a series of actions that would hit multiple pressure points at the same time. Not one move, not a gradual escalation. It would be a coordinated shift designed to create instant impact. The kind of impact that does not just affect policy, but markets, security, and global perception all at once. The first signal came from energy. Carney pointed directly at it because he knew exactly where the pressure would be felt fastest. Canada is one of the largest energy suppliers to the United States. Oil, natural gas, and electricity flow into key regions that depend on stable supply. And Carney's message was simple. Those flows are not guaranteed. They are conditional. And if those conditions are not met, they can be redirected. Not reduced, redirected. That single idea changed everything inside Washington. Cutting off or even limiting Canadian energy is not just an economic issue. It's an immediate disruption. Prices spike, supply chains tighten, industries feel the pressure within days, not months. And the most alarming part? Canada had already started building alternative buyers. There were quiet talks with Europe and strategic signals towards Asia. This was not a threat built on theory. It was a move backed by preparation. Then came trade. For years, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, has been the backbone of North American economic stability. It created predictability, reduced tariffs, and allowed businesses on both sides of the border to operate with confidence. But Carney made it clear that this framework is not untouchable. If the United States refuses to comply, Canada is ready to step away from it. And stepping away doesn't just mean policy changes on paper. It means tariffs return, costs increase, supply chains that took years to optimize suddenly become unstable. American exporters lose advantages overnight. Canadian markets shift direction.
And once that shift begins, it is not easy to reverse. Businesses do not just wait for political solutions. They adapt, they move, they find alternatives. And once those alternatives are in place, the old system does not come back the same way. But Carney did not stop there. He moved into something even more sensitive: access. Airspace, maritime routes, and strategic pathways that the United States has relied on for decades. Canada controls critical corridors that connect regions, reduce travel time, and support both commercial and military operations. And for the first time, those corridors were being positioned as leverage. The message was controlled but unmistakable. Access is not automatic. It is based on cooperation. And if that cooperation breaks down, access can be restricted. That creates delays, increased costs, and operational complications that ripple across industries. Aviation, shipping, logistics. Every sector that depends on smooth movement starts to feel friction. Almost immediately inside Washington, this is where the concern shifted from economic to strategic. When access becomes uncertain, planning becomes difficult. And when planning becomes difficult, stability starts to weaken. This is not just about trade anymore. It is about predictability, the foundation of how large systems operate. Then came the financial dimension. This is where the pressure became less visible but potentially more powerful. Carney pointed to capital flows and investments. He highlighted the deep financial connections that tie the Canadian and American economies together: pension funds, institutional investments, and long-term holdings that quietly support market stability. The idea of pulling back from those connections introduced a new kind of risk, not sudden collapse, but gradual withdrawal, a slow shift that removes support from key areas of the market over time. And that kind of movement is harder to counter because it does not happen all at once. It builds, it spreads, and by the time it becomes visible, it is already in motion. What made all of this even more intense was the sequencing. Carney did not present these actions as possibilities. He presented them as a plan, structured, ordered, and ready. Each step was designed to reinforce the next. Energy creates immediate pressure. Trade amplifies it. Access complicates the response. Finance extends the impact over time. It is not random, it is layered. Back inside the White House, the situation was becoming more complex by the hour. Advisors were not just asking whether Canada would act, they were asking how quickly each of these steps could begin. Hours? Days? And more importantly, how do you respond to something that has already been set in motion? Because this is the real shift that is happening here. For years, the United States has been in a position where it could react later and still control the outcome. It could delay decisions, reframe negotiations, and apply pressure at the right moment. But this time, the timeline is not flexible. It is fixed, and it is being controlled from outside Washington. That changes the entire dynamic. It forces decisions under pressure. It removes the ability to wait, and it introduces a level of urgency that does not just affect leaders. It affects markets, institutions, and allies watching closely. And as this pressure continues to build, one question is starting to dominate behind closed doors. Not whether the United States can respond, but whether it can respond fast enough before the consequences begin. What happened next is what truly shook Washington. It was not the demands, nor even the consequences, but the reaction from the rest of the world. Because within hours of Carney's ultimatum, it became clear that this was not a two-country standoff anymore. This was turning into something much bigger. And for the first time, the United States was not at the center of support. It was standing alone, watching alliances quietly shift. The first signal came from Europe. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was precise. Statements began to emerge, carefully worded and strategically aligned. There was support for Canada's position, an emphasis on sovereignty, and calls for balanced partnership. On the surface, it sounded diplomatic, but behind those words was something far more significant: alignment, the kind that does not happen by accident. Because when major economies start echoing the same message within hours, it means conversations were already happening before the speech. It means groundwork had been laid, and it means Canada did not walk into this moment alone. It walked in with quiet backing that only revealed itself once the ultimatum was public. Inside Washington, that realization hit hard. The entire strategy had been built on one assumption: that Canada would eventually be isolated, that pressure from the United States would force it into a corner where it had no choice but to negotiate on American terms. But now, the opposite was happening. Canada was not being isolated, it was being supported. And support changes everything. It changes confidence, it changes timing, and most importantly, it changes risk. Because acting alone is dangerous, but acting with backing creates stability. It allows stronger moves, faster decisions, and clearer messaging. And that's exactly what Carney was demonstrating. Then came the financial reaction. This is where the pressure became impossible to ignore. Within minutes of the speech, volatility spiked, not gradually, instantly. Investors were not waiting for confirmation. They were reacting to possibility. The possibility that energy flows could be disrupted. The possibility that trade frameworks could collapse. The possibility that financial ties could start to unwind. And markets do not respond to emotion. They respond to risk. The sharper the reaction, the more credible the threat. And this reaction was sharp, aggressive, and uncertain, which meant one thing: the ultimatum was not being dismissed, it was being taken seriously. Energy sectors felt it first, then financials, then industries tied to cross-border trade. Each movement in the market was a signal that the consequences Carney outlined were not just political, they were measurable, immediate, and potentially severe. Back inside the White House, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to urgency. Emergency meetings were not just happening, they were overlapping. Different departments were trying to assess different risks at the same time. Trade advisors focusing on supply chains, defense officials looking at security implications, economic teams analyzing market exposure. And yet, despite all the analysis, one problem kept coming up. There was no clear countermove. Every traditional response carried risk. Push back aggressively and you accelerate the crisis. Stay silent and you appear weak. Offer partial compromise and you risk triggering the consequences anyway. There was no clean option, no obvious path forward, and that's what made this moment so dangerous. At the center of it all was one critical issue: defense. Because while trade and markets can adjust over time, security gaps cannot. And Carney had touched on something that went far beyond economics. He pointed directly at joint defense systems, at intelligence sharing, at coordination that has been built over decades. If those systems begin to break down, the impact is not theoretical, it is immediate. Monitoring weakens, coordination slows, response times increase, and rebuilding that kind of integration doesn't happen overnight. It takes years. That's why behind closed doors, defense officials were reportedly among the most concerned. This was not just about losing cooperation, it was about losing stability. And in matters of national security, instability is not something you can afford, even for a short period. At the same time, political pressure inside the United States was starting to build more openly. Lawmakers, advisors, and industry voices were all trying to understand what this ultimatum means and how far it could go. Because while the situation was still developing, the risks were already visible. And then there was the timeline. 14 days. It sounds like time, but in reality it is pressure. Every hour that passes without a response increases uncertainty. Markets continue to react. Alliances continue to watch. Internal divisions begin to grow. And the closer the deadline gets, the harder it becomes to manage the outcome. This is where Carney's strategy becomes even clearer. He did not just create a list of demands, he created a clock. And that clock is now controlling the pace of everything. Decision-making, market reactions, and political pressure. All of it is now moving toward a fixed point in time. And the closer that point gets, the fewer options remain. Because at some stage, this stops being about strategy and becomes about choice. A decision that cannot be delayed, a response that cannot be avoided, and a moment that will define what happens next, not just for these two countries, but for the